Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Today's review is The Labyrinth for Delta Green the Role-Playing Game by Arc Dream Publishing, Part 1. In this video I'll be covering the introduction. Okay, first a bit of history. Released in 2019, The Labyrinth is a product of the second highly successful Delta Green Kickstarter and marked the return of the author John Scott Tynes, who essentially created the idea of the group Delta Green in the first ever scenario, Convergence, in The Unspeakable Oath No. 7 back in 1992. It is available as a 186-page full-colour hardback and PDF. Right to the cover. Here we have a great piece by Dennis de Twiller depicting something, and though I'm not entirely sure what, it's definitely creepy. Onto the inside. Once we get past the credits, we get to the foreword by Mike Merles, where he talks about the reason as to why a new Delta Green book by John Scott Tynes is so important. He discusses how the book contains worse things than Cthulhu and Azathoth, in the form of the grating miseries that we as a society agree need to be tackled, such as internet trolls, the greed of the rich and powerful, and newer phenomena, things like incels. It's a book of allies and enemies, and a web of secrets that show how the world has shifted since the original inception of Delta Green in the 1990s. He tells of how the labyrinth of interconnected groups and people is like a terrible game of Jenga, where pulling out one piece will shift two others, mentioning that though the world may be on a downward spiral, at least the hobby of role-playing is in a good state. So once we get past the content, we move on to the introduction. It goes into how every Delta Green game requires allies and opponents, and that the goal of this book is to give handlers both, described as a new set of lenses to view the world of Delta Green from. It has 4 potential allies and 4 obvious enemies, and each of the mini-chapters covers pretty much everything about them, including their history, agenda, important people, etc., as well as providing a story arc that has 3 stages, as well as connections that can be made between the different groups. We have a box out that discusses which Delta Green you should use. It essentially says that either the Outlaws or Program are fine, except where specified. So firstly, it lists the potential allies. These can have an immediate, more practical use in a campaign, in that they can provide clues, and it makes the point that none of them are static. They all have shifting resources due to exposure to the agents. Firstly is the Centre for the Missing Child, or CMC, a non-profit organisation that has dedicated itself to the cause of exploited, missing and murdered children. They have generally good connections to law enforcement and teach best practice at all levels, and also help investigate active cases. They can search for information, assist families and provide emotional support. It makes the point that one CMC volunteer, Joe DeWant, has an unresolved history with a particular case that can spiral into obsession with exposure to Delta Green. There's the Dream Syndicate, a group of people that quite uniquely have identical dreams of unnatural events. They catalogue them while also looking for connections in the real world to try and explain their experiences. They can potentially have dreams that are helpful to agents' investigations. One of the group's leaders, however, is a fraud who is sexually obsessed with the founder of the group and will lie to win the agent's favour in order to impress the founder. When exposed, he takes drastic action. We have Agent Renko, an operative of the Russian GRU SV8 group who is watching the agents to try and find out more and steal artefacts from Delta Green. If he gets in trouble, the agents are the only people he can ask for help, over time becoming a kind of double agent, befriending but still surveilling and reporting what they do. He is never fully trustworthy though can provide good information. Ultimately he wants to leave GRU SV8 and defect to Delta Green, but is that even the truth? Lastly we have the Witness Alliance, a non-profit that monitors, records and exposes hate groups to keep what they do in the public eye. They offer education to law enforcement on their activities as well as working with academics who study these groups. They're well connected with mainstream media at all levels. Unfortunately, they have a relationship with a former Delta Green agent who is an academic at Miskatonic University, and he is in a fragile mental state due to a lifetime fighting the fight, but more particularly due to his involvement in the collapse of the cult of transcendence. A Witness Alliance researcher is in love with him, and as he crumbles, she seeks revenge on Delta Green for his suffering. We have a piece here on cracked agents. It talks about the horror convention of one member of an ensemble being susceptible to paranormal incursions related to the story. In this book they are known as cracked. In game terms, any agent whose current SAN is below their original power times 4, their original breaking point, then they're considered cracked. If they drop below this then recover, they're not considered cracked. Agents should write it down on their character sheet but not know about the mechanic, and in the Labyrinth it serves as a guide for the handler to show things to these agents that the others don't see. If there are multiple cracked agents, the one with the lowest SAN should be chosen, or even just cycle through them. Why are they called cracked, you may ask? Well, it's because the cracks let the light into the world. After this, we move on to the antagonists. It makes the point that none of these are traditional Cthulhuid in nature. They're humans doing human things who have, through their obsessions, gone down forbidden paths, which gives them a particular view of the world. Essentially, they should be portrayed as having gone off the deep end, but still able to be interviewed on the news to explain their activities. They are not even that dangerous to begin with, though as the agents bring them into focus, they become more dangerous. First up is New Life Fertility. This is a private company that provides 100% guaranteed fertility service that is very expensive to the global elite. Though they are rooted in the realms of IVF, they're helped by a substance called lac maternum, the milk of Shub-Niggurath. They've created over 15,000 children this way, and they're starting to reach adulthood, though as they mature they are only attracted to others of their kind, and the children they birth are not even human. In a decade there will be over 10,000 of these offspring inheriting the wealth, social status and political power of their birthright, and they will murder their families if they stand in their way. After this we have the lonely. It makes the point that there are lonely people and the lonely. These people are unnaturally alone and haunted by a book that each possesses. They all interact online with a person called Captain Sunshine, who has an uncanny way of pushing them to deeper levels of misery and reinforcing their loneliness. Some of the lonely become the grim, described as bullies and stalkers online and in real life, and eventually the grim become the furious. These are the people responsible for mass shootings and violence, and we all know who they are, at least for a day or two. Captain Sunshine is actually an avatar of the King in Yellow. We have the Sowers. These are Christian sects of self-reliant communities that have strong men and weak women who have their willpower slowly sapped for daily rituals to Jesus. They have a founder who hates evangelism, and they fly under the radar while attending shooting ranges, growing crops, helping fellow members and training each other. If you rise to the rank of deacon, you can do what you want if you're willing and able to cut the throat of Azazel, an eternal angel who grants innocence for all crimes committed. And if Delta Green gets involved, they bring in a private law firm to sue the government and a PR firm to boost their public presence. Finally, we have the Prana Sodality. This New Age non-profit lives in a remote compound in Washington state. They've developed a healing technology that helps people, though the area is infested by Loigor, and the healing technology is due to a channel being opened to these alien intelligences. This part of the book is a mini source book for the town of Stanton, the place where the first production plutonium reactor was made, and a region of misery, violence and sickness. It is haunted by the ghosts of those racked with environmental disease and damaged genetics, and is replete with violence. When the agents arrive, they walk into a mass shooting and follow the downward spiral from there. Next up is mapping your labyrinth. It makes the point that the agents will not know who are allies or enemies, and that as their SAN erodes and bonds become damaged beyond repair, they're unlikely to emerge from the labyrinth. Nobody wins in Delta Green, but the trying provides the drama, excitement and indeed the horror that's expected. It advises you use this book by considering one of the 4 potential allies by relevance to the operation and introduce them into play, and it then quite handily lists all of the operations that have been released to date and shows how an appropriate group can be introduced. You need to consider the how and why, who they will meet, and then run it to see how it turns out. The usefulness of the group is important, and a way of reaching them after the operation is vital, pointing out that they could even be in the home scene if they need to be reintroduced. The second group should then be brought into play, while keeping the first around, though it makes the point that this should not be forced. For example, it would be difficult for the Witness Alliance to get involved in Antarctica. Opportunities should arise in play naturally, and relationships should develop organically. It then goes into a Labyrinth campaign. Essentially, if you don't have a campaign in mind, one can be based on the groups in this book. You should start with an enemy with New Life Fertility being suggested as they deal with children, which gives a natural crossover with Centre for the Missing Child. Joe DeWant can then be brought in as a recurring ally and his eventual collapse played out. The other groups are smaller by comparison, so can coexist within the campaign. It stresses that you shouldn't burn out this first enemy group too soon. They are by their nature quite resilient, and it should be more of a strong hit than a death blow that the agents score, and by this method they can be reintroduced later on. It then poses the question, should you use everything? While it is unlikely that you can or even should, some handlers will no doubt like the challenge, so by all means do whatever suits your playing style. The last part is final advice. It stresses that the single most important thing you can do is to pay attention to the characters. They are important individuals for a reason. In normal horror gaming, groups are expressed by clues, whereas here they're expressed by people that the agent should meet. No matter how murderous or insane they are, they can be spoken to and can bring vibrance and character to a story. He uses the example of the sowers and how sitting for dinner with them should show their soul-deadened wives with their forced smiles. Use your imagination to show these people as people. It's the characters that are important. They should tell their tales and should be helpers of the handler to make the journey of the agents through the labyrinth take unexpected twists and turns and help them understand that they can only really rely on each other. Okay, that concludes part 1 of the Labyrinth. Part 2 in this series will be a breakdown of the Centre for the Missing Child and the Dream Syndicate.